Welcome everybody to this Enhancing Road Network Resilience Through Road Maintenance webinar. I'm Ian Greenwood, ADB consultant based here in New Zealand. I'm no doubt know some of you, but not all of you. So this afternoon, this evening, this morning, depending on where in the world you may be, soon I'll hand back to Jamie Leather, the Director of Transport, to give the opening address. Then we'll be going through Tian Senning from the University of Auckland Climate Adaptation Platform. We'll speak on performance-based contracting and how that fits into things. Then Elke Becker from WSP New Zealand around some of the experiences in New Zealand around these operational resilience aspects. And then I'll be coming in after that, looking at the opportunities and what we see in the developing countries. Then we'll follow that up with the Q&A session, and hopefully somewhere on your screen there is a text box or chat box where you can submit questions. By all means, if you wish to address them to someone in particular, put our initial at the front, E-T-I-J, if it's J, or just otherwise, we'll treat them as a generic question to all of us. So with that, I would like to pass to Jamie. Now, I think within the ADB, he is very much known and respected by all, but for those who may be connected outside of the ADB, Jamie Leather is the Director of Transport. He's been with the ADB, I think, getting close towards 20 years, but this is an ideal seminar series for Jamie to present on. If you look at him up online, you'll see that for over 15 years now, he has been producing guidance and policy around the whole themes of decarbonisation, climate change, and resilience. So he's very much a leader born for this topic, and he happens to be a very nice gentleman as well. So, Jamie, over to you.
Thank you, and I'm embarrassed. I don't know how I can follow that up. So it's a definite overkill in terms of my background, but thank you very much and welcome everybody to this session. I just want to mention that Ian was stressing the sort of climate change, and yes, ADB is the climate bank for Asia and the Pacific region, but the importance of roads within there is absolutely essential. Some parties do seem to suggest that net zero transport, we should all be walking and cycling and using trains, but the fundamentals are that roads are and always will be the main mode of transport. If you look in the European context, where they have laws and regulations to look at a very balanced and sustainable and climate resilient and mitigation actions on the transport sector, 74% of passenger movements and 76% of freight movements are still by the road network. Yes, we can replace the major corridors, but for the benefits that road over other modes in terms of their ability to distribute or collect farm-to-market roads, people around, roads are absolutely essential. The other thing I wanted to mention is that there is a huge infrastructure gap in the Asia and the Pacific region. The per capita and the road network density in the Asia-Pacific region is actually the lowest in the world. It's lower than Africa and orders of magnitude below Europe and North America. So there is considerable investment required in new and upgrading of existing road networks. So the strength of the absolute essential attention to roads, the need to continue to build more roads. But getting to today's focus on road maintenance, while there's still a big infrastructure gap and a large amount of roads required, there has been unprecedented investment over the last 3 decades in road networks across Asia and the Pacific. With that big investment requires similar big downstream investment in road maintenance programs. And we are seeing in many of our developing member countries that the periodic maintenance time frame, 10, 15 years, whatever it may be, is now at a critical point. We also have noticed that ongoing annual maintenance budgets and actions are perhaps less than they need to be. So we are seeing some of those roads that have been constructed deteriorating faster, and therefore demonstrating the importance of road maintenance within here. What we also saw, say, an example of the Pakistan floods, is the need to upgrade the road network from a climate resilience perspective. Our hope and our dream and our drive, and one of the reasons we're holding this and a series of webinars in this particular area on green roads, is how can we develop new roads and make them sure they are climate resilient? How can we maintain and support governments with road maintenance programs that at the same time build in this climate resilience? And a third string to add in, because road safety is also important, if we're helping client governments or road agencies manage and improve their road network, we can do the road maintenance, we can enhance climate resilience, and we can do road safety. That's the three focus areas that we like to crowd together. But today we're looking at road network resilience through road maintenance. And this, we'll hear today some excellent global best practices. And this is one of a series of webinars we will hold. The principle we always take is, what is the best knowledge that we have out there? How can we share that knowledge to raise awareness? And this is a request and a plea to those to please put your questions there, or come and see us either in this event or post this event. How can we provide the best support to our clients across the region? It's all very well raising that awareness, showing the best practices, but putting it in local contexts and making sure we get the technical and the financial support to see action on the ground. So what you hear about in today's workshop and others within the series, how can we support you with technical assistance as well as financial assistance downstream? I do see this as one of the most important areas, transitioning from just pure road construction, filling in the missing gaps, to road network management and making sure we're maintaining them correctly, but also the very important and increasingly important need to ensure climate resilience across the road networks. And unfortunately, the region is hit with many natural disasters and climate-related weather conditions or permafrost melting, which is going to have a significant impact on the maintenance programs, the design standards, as well as making sure that we do improve drainage, ensure that we're looking at other climate resilience aspects as well. So within ADB, this is one of our prime objectives, particularly within the road subsector, which is around 50% of our financial support for the transport sector. So it's a sizable amount, probably up to around $2 to $3 billion per year, which may sound a lot, but when you're saying that there's a huge infrastructure gap in tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars across the region, we should utilize our money and our awareness and our technical support to ensure that those best practices can be scaled up and delivered through programmatic type support, to ensure they have an impact at scale and support the governments, make sure they maintain their roads so they deliver the development impacts, but also make sure they are proofed against any other climate shocks or natural disasters on the resilience side as well. So thank you all very much for joining, and I'll now pass over to Tuns, who will give us his first presentation. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Jamie. I think that was a very good statement for what we try to achieve with this webinar. I am sharing my screen. If I can just get confirmation that everybody can see my screen.
Yes, that's good. Thanks.
Thank you. So this is wonderful to be presenting to you what is tonight in New Zealand, from wherever in the world you are. The topic that I'll be dealing with is strengthening resilience through performance-based contracts. And I hope that you will recognize during the presentation that the principles from this presentation can actually be applied to any maintenance contract, regardless of what format of contracting you use. My name is Tian Zening, or as I've been known on campus, Dr. T. And my area of speciality is in investment planning for infrastructure, mostly in my life. And then sort of for the last 15 years, I started focusing quite heavily in the climate adaptation space. and then also did some work in the performance-based contracting area. It gives me great pleasure to be presenting alongside with two people that I perhaps admire the most, and also dear friends of mine, both Ian and Elke. And you will see from our presentations that we try to make our presentations complementary to each other. Just maybe a health warning from my presentation. There are some slides with tables with quite a bit of detail in it. I am not going to go into detail with every slide and the detailed text in it. The intent is more there to give you the overall concepts, and then the presentations will be available to the audience at a later stage. So at that point, you can look at it in a bit more detail. So the areas that I'm going to cover is understanding natural hazard risk management, and perhaps a little bit of asset management with that lens in it. Briefly define performance-based contracting. Ian is going to give you a little bit more substance in the application with performance-based contracting. I'm going to spend a brief moment on network criticality, given its importance in the context of tonight, and then focus quite a bit on how do we bring in resilience into these performance-based contracting. So starting off with the concept of natural hazard risk management, and I think you're all familiar with that figure on the left-hand side, which obviously comes from the IPCC, that gives us the elements of climate risk, in particular, the hazard, the exposure to the hazard, and then the vulnerability. Now, one of my mates from South Africa took this figure a little bit further and created some of the text on the right-hand side. And we see on the right-hand side all the community aspects, health, urban systems, job creation, and all of those well-being aspects. And then in between those, our infrastructure. Now, our infrastructure in the context of climate resilience fulfill two functions. The first one is for our critical infrastructure, the ones that we depend on for our basic services, we want them to at least come through storm events or natural hazard events relatively unscathed, so that the community can keep on doing what they're doing. There's also a second type of infrastructure that's specifically designed and built to protect us against impacts from storm events. And a good example for that is retaining walls and those sort of things. Now, obviously, in some storm events, those things can fail and sometimes have got catastrophic impacts. What we can do from an infrastructure perspective is we can either reduce the vulnerability or the fragility of our infrastructure itself, or we can perhaps look at reducing the exposure of the infrastructure. So these concepts is going to become clearer in later pictures. Perhaps if there's one picture to take home with you today, this is the one. It was developed by one of my colleagues in New Zealand, Hugh Cohen, and it took the classical risk management approach and applied it into the climate area. Now, what we have here on the figure is on the left-hand side, the loss value. So in an event, how much of your infrastructure can you lose? And then the percentage. So if you think about a road network, our entire network will obviously be that 100%. The lines represents different storm event or event frequencies, where a 1 in 2,500 year event is perhaps occurring quite infrequent. The probability of it happening is quite low, but when it happens, it causes a lot of damage. And then further on in the graph, the rest of those slides. Now, how we manage that risk, we can follow the management approaches in the top there, and it's further explained in the text. We can avoid the risk, we can control it, transfer, or accept. I'll start with the two extremes first. In some areas, the exposure and the vulnerability and the risk can be so high that no matter how much money you throw at the infrastructure, you're going to lose it. We typically have infrastructure such as coastal infrastructure that with any size event, it gets damaged, and perhaps we should think about moving that infrastructure somewhere else to avoid the risk. Then for a large part of our network, it may not be that vulnerable, it may not be that exposed to hazards, so the risk is really low of damages, so we won't be too concerned about those in a climate sense. The two that we work on mostly is under the control, and control means you take ownership yourself of this risk and you deal with it. So you can either improve it or some of the strategies I will discuss later. The other strategy is, of course, that we can transfer the risk. Now, typically, there's two mechanisms in which we transfer risk in routing contracts. The first one is we can either do a contractual risk transfer, so we make the contractor responsible to carry that risk, or we can take a financial instrument such as insurance to cover us against that risk. Now, typically, the items that has got quite a significant return on investment from a climate perspective, we will invest money in that, and the other ones we will perhaps look at transferring that risk. Now, most of what I'm going to talk about tonight will cover these two, of course, within a strong focus on the risk that we transfer in a performance-based contract. In any situation, when we do investment planning, and in particular in constraint investment, which most of us is under, I haven't come across any road agency in the world that says we've got too much money or we've got enough money. Most of us is short of cash. Now, what we need to do with the little bit of money we get is we've got to maximize the outcome. And that outcome is maximized across these three areas as a minimum. There could be more. But in the first instance, we can maximize our investment to give the best return to our customers, to our community. We can maximize our investment by making sure that our infrastructure lasts longer. So this is the typical keeping the road in good conditions, doing your maintenance, and then also maintaining the future deterioration that we expect. And then in the third instance, we will invest in resilience. And in the resilience, I will talk in the next slide about the 3 R's in the resilience that is also showed in that figure. There could be others. So, for example, some networks do have issues with travel safety. So safety can also be a focus for our investment. The reason why I start with this slide is because in any performance-based or any contracts for that matter, is one of the things you've got to stand still and think about in the beginning is, what do I want to achieve? What am I trying to see as outcome from this contract? Now, in nature, performance-based contracts are normally quite long. They varies between 5, 6, up to 10 years. So we want to make sure that we know exactly what we want as an outcome from that contracts. Also, just a little bit of background on the climate risk process. Now, in the area that I work in integrating climate adaptation to asset management, we follow this process. Now, this figure comes from South African or Southern African guidelines. It's called the RECAP guidelines. I do encourage you to look at those fantastic documents. There's one on risk management, there's the engineering solutions and others. So this one comes out of the risk management process, and it looks at the types of data that we collect, climate risk data, the road network data, and then also the socioeconomic data. We do the analytics to understand the hazard exposure, road criticality, and then from that process, we end up with an understanding of what is the risk index, what is my road criticality, and from that point onwards, we can do the planning. Now, at the start of any contract or at the start of doing climate adaptation in any region, you need to go through this process. So it is quite universal. Quickly on performance-based contracting, and as I said, Ian will go into this in a little bit more detail. So Let's perhaps start from this end. The traditional contracts, you will tell the contractor what work to go and do. They execute the work. As a consequence, the roads may be in a certain condition, and because of that conditions, your customer is going to feel or experience the road in a certain way. It may be smooth, it may be rough, and they may complain about it. With performance-based contracting, we actually go the opposite way. So we first decide, what do I want to give my customer in terms of performance level? And through that, then we specify what the road condition and situations need to be. And then we give it to the contractor and they decide how they're going to achieve that. Now, the big difference is with traditional contracts, we pay for the work that's completed. With performance-based contracting, we pay for the outcome. I normally say the biggest advantage of performance-based contracting is you get what you ask for. And one of the biggest limitations of performance-based contracting is you get what you ask for. So the bottom line is make sure you know what to ask for in the first place. I said I will talk about the 3 R's in the resilience. So it's robustness. So this is pre-event, readiness and resourcefulness, and then how we respond. So all of this makes up how resilient a system is. Now, tonight, you're going to hear mostly about the resilience in the physical asset space. So we're talking about the resilience of the road network. But keep in mind, we also need to look at the resilience of a community. We also need to look at the resilience of an organization to respond to events. But tonight, we're talking infrastructure. And then also the types of impacts. In tonight's talk, we covered both the gradual changes in climate. So it's getting wetter over time, it's getting hotter over time, it's getting drier over time. We also talk about shock event, all natural hazards. So that includes earthquakes and weather events. And then obviously we get this bit in the middle that we have to deal with on our road networks. So framing up the performance-based contracting, I think one of the most important steps, and even if your performance-based contracting doesn't go ahead, this planning and preparation part is perhaps the most important, because it makes you think what your network needs. It makes you think about what it needs in particular for resilience. So we will have a performance-based consultant that will do this preparation work for us, release the tender, and then the contractor comes on board. In the typical performance-based contracts that we follow in developing countries, we normally have that in 2 components. And tonight I'm advocating a 3rd component, but in any case, so you've got this front up bit, which is capital investment at the start. The intent is there to get the network up to a good condition, into a resilient state, and we do that through capital works. And then for the remainder of the contract, we want to make sure that the network performs well, so our maintenance and operations, and then make sure that we also maintain the resilience, again focusing on all 3 R's. And there's ways to describe robustness, and I'm probably going to focus mostly on that. But there's also the elements of spare capacity. Perhaps if you've got a large unsealed road network, you need a few extra graders or access to a few extra graders in dealing with an emergency. And then, of course, all the response and rebuilding following an event. So this is how we do it. And this is the whole concept. Now, I must give credit to Ian Greenwood. We have developed this framework. Ian, I cannot remember if it was over a bowl of salad or over a beer, maybe because we're both not vegetarian, it was the latter, but in any case, so I have spoken about the 2 components in performance-based contracting, the design and construction, and then the maintenance and operate. Now, when we bring in the resilience aspect, the whole risk element comes in. And there's a principle in performance-based contracting that you want to give some risk to the contractor, but not too much, because then you're going to start paying for them carrying excessive risk. So you've got to have a balanced position of risk sharing between the asset owner and the contractor. So what we have came up with these 3 bars, and I'm going to focus on that. So it's 3 events. The first one is for an event that's above your risk envelope, an event that's below your risk envelope, and then for the catastrophic events that nobody foreseen happening. So it's quite easy if the event is within the risk envelope specified for the contract. The contractor is responsible for all the repairs, except if there's damage due to extraordinary circumstances. And there's always some of those that you also have to recognize. If it's above the envelope, then the agency will cover the cost for the repairs and the rebuild, except there may be deductions. If the contractor didn't adhere to the resilience specifications in the contracts, then they will be liable for failures in that area. So, for example, if there's a pipe and the pipe should be cleaned as per the contract and it wasn't clean when the storm event happens, it was blocked and there's erosion that took the road away, that damage will be paid for by the contractor themselves. And then the catastrophic events, when everything is up into the air and basically the contract disappears into the ether, there is the opportunity of using the contractor while they're on the site and then morph the contract into a rebuild contract rather than a maintenance contract. So we've got very good examples out of New Zealand on that. I think Elke might touch on some of those. For me, in the development of this concept, the hardest bit was perhaps to specify the cut-off points and the criteria for when is a storm a certain size. And I think, like anybody else, I've gravitated towards a return period until I've realized how difficult specification around return periods are, because return periods does not always quantify the ability of a storm to cause damage. It depends on where the eye of the storm is, exactly what the catchment characteristics are, and all of those things. So with my hydrology colleagues, we've came up with a process of saying, now you've got to only specify boundaries in terms of things that you can measure. You can measure temperature, you can measure ambient temperature, road temperature, you can measure rainfall. And then for the downflow areas is you can install basically a flow depth meter in critical positions in the network, and you can quantify that storm intensity quite beautifully. And yet we can see the typical curve that looks at peak discharge against the rainfall duration. And for this catchment area, we can see if the storm event is 20 minutes long, that is the time that the raindrop will go from the furthest point in the catchment to the point that we are concerned about. And that is when you will get your peak discharge. But we need to quantify that with a physical measure, and then also seismic activities through the seismological stations.
About 5 minutes there, Tiens.
How long?
About 5.
5 minutes, I will make it. Then road classification, quite important to take functional and hierarchical road classification, where we've got motorways on the one side, free-flowing, limited access to local roads, and we bring in the criticality lens. Now, just 2 concepts. Criticality talk about what the issue is that we try to prevent, so it's the downstream impacts. Climate risk is the vulnerability of the fragility of the infrastructure and how exposed it is. Now, those 2 give us the priority. So criticality is very important in planning network resilience investment. There's an example of typical road criticalities that you can define. There's a description. So we've got the low impact criticality road network on this side. We will do very little to no additional resilience requirements to the supercritical stuff, where we actually got to focus in quite a bit on the resilience. You also need to understand before you go into the contract what can go wrong. So, and what you should do about it, because ultimately these are the things you want to incentivize the contractor to do. So you want to understand that before you will be able to define performance specifications. And here's a good example of performance specifications. We look at the weather impact. We see what it can do to our roads and related infrastructure, and then what do we need to do in terms of our contract? What sort of behavior do we want to encourage? And Ian has got a classical one-liner that he will talk about in ensuring there's routine maintenance always taking place. I will leave it to Ian and not steal his thunder. And here are some examples of performance measures, both operational performance measures and key performance measures that we can use in the resilience space. For example, with bridge structures, we want to make sure that it's structurally sound. We want to make sure that it's hydraulically functioning well. There's got to be no debris, and there's also limit the defects over time with conditions. Just a side note on bridges, also make sure upstream, and especially in forestry areas, Elke will show you some devastating damage that happens once the timber washes down and block the bridge flow paths. Here's a good example of performance measures for bridges from a earthquake perspective. So we've got different earthquake severities, and then looking at the damages, acceptable damages that we have for certain events. What is the post-earthquake function immediately following the event and then after reinstatement? So typically this can be used in a performance-based contract. And then just in conclusions, my key messages, we always think that resilience is too expensive. I disagree with that. I think you cannot afford not to do resilience. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit, routine maintenance being one of them. Performance-based contracts can be a very effective vehicle for adopting good asset management and adopting good resilient asset management. Points to remember: target your investment decisions, and it must be balanced in what we want to agree on. Risk transfer needs to be considered, which is going to be the risk that the contractor carries, typically the party that manages the risk. Blanket risk transfer is very costly, and then have clear KPIs and OPMs measures. And then always think, what are you going to do about the things you haven't thought about? So those blind spots, and they will always be there. Believe me, every storm event that I've experienced had some of those unexpected outcomes. So you need to also think how you will deal with those in the contract. And I'm going to take questions later. At this point in time, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Elke Becker. Elke is originally from Wyoming, the States in the United States. Fortunately, she came to New Zealand with her parents, and she did engineering science at the university that I'm teaching in, and has made a remarkable impact on asset management in this country. So Elke, it gives me pleasure to hand the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Jones. That was a wonderful introduction. Very, very kind, and a little bit over the top, but thank you nonetheless. So welcome everyone, and it's a real pleasure to be here. My name's Elke, and as Jones introduced, I am with WSP as a technical director. And my background is actually in road maintenance and management, and I cut my teeth, I guess, nearly 20 years ago in performance-based contracting locally here, where I'm located in Tauranga in New Zealand, and have had the privilege to work both alongside Ian Greenwood and Jones over the last couple decades in investment planning and asset management. So it is a real privilege to be here. So today, I guess this session will start to drop down more to an operational level from the theory and concepts that Jones has introduced. And what I've tried to do is weave in stories from New Zealand, kind of live case studies and examples to help bring some of those concepts down to the ground level. So in my title, Kia kaha, is a Maori word, which is our native language here in New Zealand, meaning stay strong, which I think is really applicable to this topic of resilience, reflecting, the importance of strength, not only of our infrastructure, but as Choon's kind of started to allude to, of the communities and the responders in events that occur. So really applicable to this discussion. So today, can I just check, is my screen sharing?
Not yet. I was just going to say you haven't
Not
showed
yet.
it yet.
Not yet,
Okay.
LP.
Okay, apologies for that. Forgot to click the little last button. There we go. Is that
We've got
better?
we've got your presenter screen on it
Okay,
rather than the
apologies.
presentation. So if you go up to that display settings one, I think you
There
can
we go.
switch.
There we go. Okay, is
Yep,
that better?
perfect.
Okay,
Lovely.
excellent. So apologies for that. Okay, so today, I guess covering off again at an operational level, looking at that before, during, and after, and aspects that we can take on the ground to help make our networks more resilient. This is a little example from Cyclone Gabrielle, which devastated the New Zealand North Island East Coast just about a year ago this last week, kind of showing our nice network beforehand. This bridge, the Arapanui Bridge, which is kind of a lifeline route between two fairly significant communities of Napier City and Gisborne, entirely wiped away. And then after the reinstatement of a Bailey Bridge as an interim response to our final rebuild. So with those three lenses in mind, I'd like to start kind of at the top. And Choon's has largely covered off this space of how do we prepare ourselves for resilient events. A tiny bit of context before I jump in, given I will be talking in a New Zealand context, just for your awareness. In New Zealand, our road networks are owned and funded through our central government and through our local governments. So we have very limited private funding on our roads. And we have an overarching agency called Waka Kotahi New Zealand Transport Agency, who own and are the stewards of what's called our state highway network, which carry about 50% of our general traffic. And the other 50% of traffic is carried by what are called local roads. So in this presentation, I'm really talking to our state highway networks and the approach of Waka Kotahi. But I'd like to hope that these principles and examples that we're going to step through are applicable right across New Zealand, and hopefully for many of you, have some bearing as well. So we do have a national resilience framework in place, and it has been developed along the principles that Choon stepped through, really focusing on those high impact, low frequency events. So in that area of that control and transfer on Choon's original diagram. So where can we get the best bang for buck for our investment when we are looking to improve our network. So the process that we've gone through is taking data that's either readily available or can be collected easily, and pull that together to help us inform where to invest improvement money. So this has largely been built up with open data sets that help inform, geography, our geology, our sea level rise, historical flood and earthquake, volcanic and tsunami forecasting has helped to derive these priority risk ratings. So what we have now is a map right across the New Zealand State Highway Network of priority sites for investment, recognizing, as Choon's really clearly demonstrated, we can't fix everything. We can't eliminate the risk across our entire network. So we need to be very very specific and focused on where and how we invest, and using data to inform that is really essential. So we've arrived in a fairly good position now across the state highway network that we can understand where our improvement money can be spent. But renewing existing assets or building new assets with more resilient can be prohibitively expensive. We all know that there's a limited amount of funding, and there is absolutely a funding gap in what we would like to do and what we can actually afford in eliminating the hazards. So as a result, engineering controls such as this example is the trigger action response plan, are used to give us a more cost-effective temporary alternative to actually investing in renewing or new infrastructure. So what the TARP is a map identifying the trigger, which again Choons has indicated in his presentation, which talks to the level of risk that we can take, the actions, so the steps that are taken before and during an event to address that risk, and the response, so what happens following the event to bring the infrastructure back to an acceptable level of risk. So looking at a TARP on the ground, this is an example for a river flow rate. So similar to Choon's example, looking at the flow through the river, identifying different statuses or kind of traffic light colors, so that the teams on the ground have a detailed description of how to respond as an event is approaching. In this example, a rainfall event. So we can understand at different flow rates in this example, what action needs to be taken. There are lots of acronyms on this chart, so apologies for that, but they relate to different parties who are involved in the maintenance and management of the network. So very clear description of at what point in time, what trigger, what action needs to be taken, who needs to be informed, and what the response is following that event, so that we've got a documented process to help inform how we deal with events as they arrive and land on our doorstep and start to impact our networks. So moving a little bit more into that routine maintenance space and actions that we take at a local operational level. This is an example out of our network contracts, which are rolled out right across our state highway network. Choons also spoke to the importance of operational performance measures, so getting out and ensuring that regular maintenance is undertaken. So across our networks, we do have operational measures relating to our drainage infrastructure to ensure that they're inspected and cleared in a regular manner. And these are just a couple of examples. This is looking at our side, our unlined water channels, of which we have a monthly audit frequency to ensure that they're cleared and cleaned. Sumps, manholes and catch pits on an annual basis. Our culverts as well, whilst we do have a continual cycle going around our network, the expectation across our state highway network is that on an annual basis, every single culvert will have been inspected and cleared to the level of service required. And I guess as we all know, there's no guarantees that just because a bit of infrastructure like a culvert has been cleared that it's not going to be blocked the next day. But knowing that it at least has been identified, located, and action has been taken is really important to have embedded in your contracts. It's astounding, even in New Zealand, with the data that we have available, the number of bits of infrastructure like culverts that we are still finding on our network that we weren't previously aware of. So data becomes really, really essential. And finally, the criticality aspect. So through our prioritization of understanding our network, we can also pinpoint where our vulnerable assets are. And on those vulnerable assets, we can implement a more rigorous inspection regime. So in vulnerable areas with vulnerable infrastructure, we have a much more rigorous response and also lean on the trigger action plan. So when an event is coming, there's an action in place to get out and inspect those vulnerable bits of infrastructure in advance of an event where we have time. So that means in the areas that we know are most vulnerable and most likely to be impacted by an event, we can advance or speed up the typical routine maintenance that would otherwise occur and ensure that we have the best bang for buck and best opportunity to keep our networks open and resilient. And I'll jump in very shortly. This diagram on the right-hand side is just part of the emergency procedures and preparedness process for our vulnerable flood sites. So stepping into that next space, I think a very key document when we get to the managing events and post-event is having a plan in place that identifies who is involved, what their roles are, what their responsibilities are, so that the operational team can effectively manage events as they come on board. It talks to the communications, it talks to the operational processes, checklists. The preparedness plan has detour maps in place so that we have a concise plan with all of the key information for the range of events that may hit our network. So at an operational level, we have consistency in how we deal with events as they come on board. So this has been, I think, a really key improvement that we've seen across our networks over the last few years, getting consistency in how we respond to events and hazards. So this diagram looks at, well, this is pulled from the emergency preparedness plan. And again, leaning into the people side and the communication side, looking at the different levels of event from a normal day right through to a catastrophic eruption or flood event. What's involved, how we respond, the impact to the road, and who's responsible, who needs to be communicated with, and how do we advance communications. So the EPP plan is, I think, a really key document that all networks should have in place to document the emergency response process. This is an example close to home here in Tauranga, a network that services our fifth largest city in New Zealand. Unexpectedly, this happened literally a couple weeks ago. A little hole on the side of the road appeared, and what was discovered was a tomo, so an entire cavern filled with water that was right across the breadth of the road. And what I guess the key piece of the key takeaway from this was that despite all of the measures that we have in place and the management and maintenance that we carry out on the network, there was a culvert under this bit of road, and there was also a stormwater pipe from the utility sector that had ruptured and over the years had just carved out a cavern, which unbeknownst to the traveling public left merely a 200 mil bit of asphalt over top of an entire cavern. But what was fantastic with the response, once this was identified, was the clear ability to close the road, get detours in place, and have contractors on site, resources identified in terms of material sourcing and remedial action through the plans that were stood up. So for something that could have been absolutely catastrophic, the response and turnaround was exceptional. The communication to the public was well carried out, which made what could have been a catastrophe turn into quite a straightforward process. There was a five-day closure. This is just an example that has been snapped out of our emergency preparedness plan that was put directly into action as soon as that incident was identified. Another case. 5 minutes, yeah. Okay, great. Another case study was around a cyclone which hit just prior to Cyclone Gabrielle and took out the road network to one of our beach communities. This case study really emphasized the importance of having access to local resources in an emergency event, and having access to having contracts in place that enable quick and well thought through responses without having to go through significant procurement to get action underway. So what was pegged to be a 3-year repair was able to be delivered in less than a year, saving significant money and I guess pain for the traveling public. So I think one of the key learnings, we've got a handful here, but the fast tracking of consenting to shorten design and construction, parallel construction of the infrastructure alongside the design, using standardized design, and ensuring that you have access to local materials to advance the response. And the final piece is looking at our Cyclone Gabrielle. So almost a year ago today, Cyclone Gabrielle hit, which was pitched as the worst storm to hit New Zealand this century. This was a level 5 national state emergency that has only been declared 3 times in New Zealand. Rainfall was well beyond the forecast, and previous recordings had over 400 meters in some catchments, with winds over 130 kilometers. Stop banks were breached in 22 locations. The heavy rainfall caused extreme flows and a number of bridge failures right across the network. In total, we had 30 bridges collapse, most which needed a complete rebuild. 25 bridges had significant damage or their approaches were washed out, and 86 bridges had moderate damage, impacting traffic to some degree. So the response was, the event was incredibly intense, incredibly disruptive for the communities. There were 11 deaths, and communities were entirely severed for almost a week within that eastern Bay of Plenty area. So just stepping through the on-the-ground response, I guess what was really challenging with this event was it wasn't picked to hit this area. And there was minimal warning. The cyclone was coming, but it wasn't meant to be significant across the Hawke's Bay. When the event hit overnight, there was power loss, limited information, a national state of emergency was declared, and basically the emergency response team needed to pull together and make a plan. By day 2, the team had been pulled together and clear roles established. Data was started to be collected. And in fact, in those first 3 days, the inspections on the bridges were already completed, and there was a clear view at a local level of the damage on the ground. And that became really, really essential for starting that emergency response for restoring access back to the communities. Within that first week, the enormity of the situation hit as comms started to come back online. So the first week was paper-based and handwritten meetings, because there was no connectivity, bridges were out, no power or comms were available. So very, very challenging situation for the teams to deal with. So in terms of learnings and, you know, what that team in a really quick summary have kind of taken away, establishing defined roles and responsibility within the team really early on is one of the keys to success in this response. The collaborative approach between the clients and contractors and other consultants enabled the effective sharing of information and that common understanding of what the status of the situation was. Being able to implement appropriate technology and a shared data space, again, really helped with the sharing of information. So in this space, there were multiple contractors, consultants, and asset owners involved, and getting that single source of truth for information when comms were down and became a really essential component. Designing a intelligent triage system allowed the ability to communicate effectively for different purposes. And those pre-existing contractual frameworks really helped to mobilize resources that had historic and legacy knowledge of the network to really get action on the ground straight away. So communication was the key outcome from this to the success of the response in Kaikoura. So just wrapping up, I know I'm in the last minute or so. Before events, being prepared, those emergency preparedness plans, which help to detail the communication and parties involved and how you respond when an event hits, data and access to those that information to inform where to prioritize and prioritize your time in advance of an event, particularly in that maintenance space. During an event, getting access to sites, readiness of responders, safety considerations, maintaining the lifeline routes, and roles, responsibilities, and communication. And we're well and truly still working through the after in Cyclone Gabrielle, and it will be many years before we're out of the woods, but the response has been outstanding to date, and our ability to reconnect communities has been a testament to the teams involved. So I'll just close with a story. You can click on this link just to have a look through a storyboard of a different event, which draws in the importance of data and how data can be used to improve our ability to respond to events. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Elke.
I will now hand over to Ian, who needs no further introduction.
That's a good introduction right there. Can I just ask Elke and Tiens, if you jump into the Q&A box there, there's some questions you can probably type a response to while you ignore what I have to say. So what I want to do is just take a bit of work that you've heard from Tian's and Alki, and put in the context of developing countries. So I've been fortunate to have worked, I think, fast approaching about 40 countries around the world. That includes all the continents apart from Antarctica. So, and I've been doing a lot of work with the ADB, with Jamie and Mike and Yara, around a number of these policy work, and then with Tian's on a number of guidance documents. So what I'm just trying to look at is how do we take these initiatives and bring them into what is really the developing world context. So first of all, hopefully, is this flicking through for you? Have you seen? There we go. So the problems we see, first of all, unmaintainable assets. So some of the challenges from a maintenance point of view is that we get things like culverts being put in that are so small that they block easily, but also they can't be easily maintained. So it's sort of like we've saved $1 on construction, but then we've ended up with a situation that essentially that dollar becomes a blocked dollar and wasted right from the start. We also have the situation where we might have a maintainable asset, but it's not being maintained. And I guess the message I see out of some of these is that a climate resilient society is more than just the road network. We need to look in many countries of the role of, for instance, litter disposal. We've got countries where there isn't this ability to household garbage and the like, so it gets dumped in our sidewalks and into the streams and into the culverts. And so we can't hope to actually create a climate resilient society or even a transport system if we're not addressing these wider issues. These, again, the scenario where the shoulder, the berms are a bit high, so as a result, the water ponds on our roads softens them. Here, Earth Road, it's always going to struggle in a very wet environment, but when the wheel tracks ahead of winter are already such that the water is sitting in there just ponded in mud, we quickly lose our resilience. So are we actually doing the right work before the winter storms to make sure we've given ourselves a chance? Another one is that ability to control what happens on the side of the road. So here, a well-designed road, once upon a time had nice quality side drains, but then that ad hoc development comes in, and I suspect you've all seen it, the side drain gets completely filled back in because somebody wants to build a house or a shop or something alongside the road. So again, we need to look at those controls if we're going to have a resilient network. It doesn't matter what we build, how big the drain is, if it's going to just be filled back in like this. We also, again, we have these repeated things where the private access ways come in and block drains. We've got a bit of power infrastructure there again, right in a place where it does impact on us. Now, I should say, I acknowledge that climate change and climate resilience is more than just about water. Been dealing with permafrost melting issues in Mongolia and different ones. So, but I will use the water issue just because it's a simple one that I think the vast majority of us can readily understand. Here again, good side drain, but then we've gone and put a big dam in the middle in the name of an edge market post. So we need to get smarter. Again, a chain is defined by its weakest link. And it's the same here. We're building dams in the middle of our stormwater channels. Here, fast eroding soils. We don't have the erosion control in them. And so all of this material ultimately washes down, and then washes down, blocks the culvert. The culvert then gets washed out in the next storm, and we lose a road when we should have been addressing the fact that we've actually got this sediment issue further upstream, and we needed to actually get in there, do the right rip wrap or similar to actually prevent that from happening in the first place. And again, a huge portion of the world's network, and even here in New Zealand, about half of it, is an unpaved network of gravel roads. Gravel roads, they need maintenance. They need that shape so the water runs off the road. The road like this, had it been graded up and down, you've sorted out the side drains, you've sorted out the camber of the road. But when you don't do that, you quickly get the scenario where the water runs down the road. Again, it takes the gravel, washes it into our culverts, and suddenly what could have been prevented with a very simple grade ends up being culvert washed out, communities cut off. So we lose our resilience just because we're not doing that basic maintenance. And the good old chestnut, we've built all this infrastructure essentially to hold rubbish and debris, and we're getting no value at all out of it. You question, was it actually worth spending $1 on right from the start? Are we better off to actually just leave these as open drains where there's a chance they would get maintained? Adjacent shop owners, landowners may be able to clean them, but when we cover them in large bits of concrete, we're actually creating something which needs better equipment and dedicated resources to maintain. So the consequences of that, if we look at it from the bank's member countries, a lot of our roads are not delivering the resilience they were originally designed for. A lot of them are not even, wouldn't meet the climates of a decade or 2 decades ago. And here we are discussing what might be coming in the 1, 2, 3 decades ahead of us. But because we're not doing that maintenance, we haven't even covered off today. So we're getting further away from where we want to be because we're not doing the day-to-day activities. We're putting assets at risk. So we see culverts being blocked, then the water runs over the road, strips the surface off, washes out the culvert, and washes out the road, simply because there wasn't the money spent and the focus on doing the maintenance before those events. And as Alki and Tens have said, there's some things we can do beforehand to prevent these things from occurring. I was involved in running the Auckland motorway network here in New Zealand for a number of years. And we knew there were certain catch pits that filled up with leaf debris and other things more often than the rest. When there was a storm coming, we would go out and make sure those were clean. We didn't wait until the storm and then go, there's a pond on this piece of road, and then try and fix it. We fixed it beforehand. And really the concern is that a lot of the resilience that we've invested in is actually being lost from the network. So the causes, broadly looking at it, I would say there's issues of design, funding, and an understanding. You can get away with being a little bit bad at one of those 3. So if you don't have all the funds, but you've got good design and you've got very good people in your maintenance teams, you can get away with it. But what we see too often is, we have substandard designs, a significant lack of funds for maintenance, and I'd say maintenance, so that's routing, periodic renewal, grading and gravelling roads, etc. And there's a lack of understanding of what's important. Sometimes it's a lack of technical understanding, sometimes it's political directives to be doing other stuff. I've been in countries where the maintenance teams are out painting the curbs, yellow and black or white and black to make it look nice and tidy, yet the catch pits and the drains right behind them are blocked. So it's not that the money is not there, it's not being spent where it would do the best. So and proper designs, if we look at that, it shouldn't happen, but we do need to look at our design standards. When were they last updated? In particular, do we have the right rainfall that we're even designing for? But importantly, bring your maintenance teams into those design standard decisions. Examples all over the world. When I was in the UK, the drainage team came up with this really smart way to do new catch pits and drainage on their roundabouts. Big, multi-lane roundabouts above their motorways and the likes. The only thing was, They didn't talk to the maintenance team, and the maintenance team pointed out afterwards that it was a smart plan, but they could no longer maintain them without shutting down the entire interchange. If they'd changed and gone slightly different with the maintenance team's input, they would have had a solution which was both good from a design point of view, but also good from a maintenance point of view. So we can't just have designers designing stuff without that input from how do we maintain it. Funding, very few countries don't have enough funds. And here's an example, where this particular country is generating about $1 billion a year from its road network. So that's from fuel tanks, vehicle registration, tolls, etc. The maintenance needs of the network is about a third of that, so less than 300 million. But what they actually get is about 87 million. So getting less than 9% of the money that comes in for roads, actually hitting the road to keep it in a good condition and to keep it resilient. And so it's not an issue of is there money, it's a case of is it being spent well. In this case, this country is spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year building new stuff, but not spending a little bit more to actually look after what they have. And going on with that priority issue, we need to make sure that we've got that mindset that we cannot build our way to a climate resilient future without consideration of the maintenance. We're seeing too often that we want to build new, but there's no actually recognition of the need to do the maintenance. And so if we look at some of these things, if we're looking at building a kilometre of new road, and if that's coming at the expense of maintenance, you're probably giving up around 50 kilometres of existing road. If you take that to an extent, you might be quite happy. You've got a 20-kilometre road upgrade project where you're making it nice and resilient. That could potentially have just put 1,000 kilometres of your network at risk. So that's what we need to be looking at, is the fact of, where is the balance here? So we need to get that whole pyramid going. We need to invest in the asset management. What are the service levels? What are these critical networks? The work that Alki showed, the work that Tian said, what do we need to do? What can we live with? What do we need to avoid? Because we can't make it all perfect. We then need to make sure we're fully funding the routine maintenance, the periodic, rehabilitating those funds. And if we come up short in money, this should be the new infrastructure that we give up. But instead, most countries work in reverse. They say, we want to spend all the money on this new stuff that we wish to do. We'll then do some rehabilitation. And by the time we get to maintenance and asset management, often there's no money or such little money that so as to be ineffective. So the simple rule, if it's worth spending $100 to build, it's probably worth $2 a year to look after it. And that's what we need to have, that idea. We need to get our high priority activities. If you're in a rainy area, making sure we're focusing on cleaning the drains, making sure our shoulders are correctly shaped so the water runs to the drains, repairing potholes before the rainy season, doing the crack sealing before the rainy season. If it's unpaved network, giving the grade and making sure that things are working correct, and keeping on top of that resurfacing program. As Alki said, that whole planning of what are you going to do before, during, after these events is essential if we're going to create a resilient society, because a resilient road is only part of it. It is the society we're trying to create resilient. So it's what can we do all the way through? We also, I guess, and this goes more to the ADB staff, we need to stop trying to justify projects on fictitious benefits. If we've got a project in a country where they don't do maintenance, it is fundamentally wrong to model and create benefits on the assumption that maintenance will occur. So we see countries which use HDM4 and similar tools where the model says, this is how much benefit and this is how long this asset will last. And you go, oh, that's all very good, but you've assumed that you're going to have a really good maintenance regime, yet we know that doesn't occur. And perhaps it's a case where we need to start looking and saying, if a country is only funding 30% of the need, you only claim 30% of the benefit. And that would start saying, well, the countries who are actually spending the money on maintenance would actually be the ones who get the highest priority for doing more work. It might be extreme, but in fact, it's essentially what you should be doing now anyway, recognising that you can't claim benefits that were never actually going to be there. In the interest of time, I know Tian said I'm going to cover this. I'm actually going to flick over this quite quickly, just so we've got more time for Q&A. But what I would say is when we see it in a developing country context, when we outsource, yes, we do some of the asset management functions, that's all good, often not particularly well. So if we're talking about the typical your OPBRC or OPRC model, emergency response is consistently weak. There's this whole view that the public sector, the force account, need to be doing emergency response. And what Alki has shown, and it's been shown time and time again all over the world, that the private sector are just as capable of responding to an emergency, and they care just as much as the public sector do. So I think now we do need to get a lot better in that emergency response area across all of our contracts to make sure when these emergencies hit, we can deal with them. And we had this issue in one of the Pacific nations. There was a cyclone that had gone through, and when they went to talk to their contractor, because there was no requirement to do emergency response, the contractor had already taken on private contracts to go and do other stuff. So, we need to make sure we've got that covered. Picking models, there is a process to go through to make sure we get the right sort of contract model out of this. And as Tian said, a real key part of outsourcing, whether you do maintenance-only contracts or long-term toll roads, is understanding risk and how do you share it? How do you incentivize a contractor to make sure they're staying on top of those climate resilient critical activities? And as Tian said, if the bridge or a culvert is not being cleaned and it washes out, it's only right the contractor should pay to put it back in. And so it's how we deal with those things to make sure the network is being really looked after, and particularly at the right time of the year. So in summary, what I want to get through here, and then we'll get to some Q&A for a few minutes, is that the number one thing you can do for your network is routine maintenance. No matter how important or how priority you look at upgrades somewhere, I can pretty much guarantee if you did the numbers, routine maintenance will win hands down. When we looked at this in the UK a number of years back, I think the routine maintenance economic return was 16 times that of doing a capital upgrade project. And so, it's just absolutely dominates. So we cannot build our way out of to a climate resilient future without maintenance. The idea that we are going to do more and more upgrades, as Jamie said at the start and has been emphasised by the others, it's maintenance which actually delivers us a climate resilient future. We go there once, we do all these improvements, and that might be it for the next 20, 30, 40 years. In between, it is maintenance that delivers. And it's got to deliver from day one through to the end of year 50 or whatever that happens to be. For most countries, we know it's not a lack of funding that's the issue. It's not even a lack of funding in the road sector that is an issue. For most countries, it's a lack of prioritisation of those funds into the area that would do most good. And yes, we've got to consider safety and all the other factors that are going on. But when we look at it, typically they all come out together. If you're looking at a solution which is a good climate resilient solution and is a good decarbonisation solution and is a good road safety solution and a good asset management solution, they're typically all the same solution. So these things are not really competing as much against each other. They're more reinforcing that there are some things which are good things to do, and we need to get the politicians behind and everyone else behind to say that is what we want. We need to look at how we evaluate the merits of investments to make sure we are saying, are we likely to actually ever see these? Are these benefits going to accrue? Or are we doing such little maintenance that realistically, we're building it and it's going to deliver very little within 12 months' time. And my favourite little saying there, remember that a blocked big culvert carries the same water as a blocked small culvert. It just costs you more to actually construct. So if we're not going to look after the things, let's stop building them. Let's actually have a real sensible look and say, what is it that we can maintain? How do we actually spend money wisely and actually get some good life out of this, the asset and out of the network we've got? And let's not look after 20 kilometres while 1,000 fall apart in the background. We need to get this balance right. We can't, as Jamie said, the Asia Pacific region is well underserved by the transport networks. There's a huge investment needs to come. That can't come at the expense of throwing away everything that's already there. So with that, I'm going to end myself, and I'll get Elke and Tians back online, and we'll just have a look at some of these Q&As. Or have you answered some of them as already?
Correct, Ian. I would like to just say something about the concrete roads. And as I have indicated there, through a UK project, the new Road Note 31 do cover quite a bit of climate consideration in design. So you can certainly have a look at that. The person that asked the questions has rightfully noted the value of using concrete roads in sensitive areas, and I fully support that. In the old days, we only built them for very busy roads, but I think it's also a very effective climate mitigation option. Something else that I do encourage you to have a look at, and that's also in the Road Note 31, is the increasing use of epoxy additives to bitumen, both asphalts and also in chip seals. Because that gives you the more robust seal, but it also is not so sensitive to hot climates or very cold climates. So also look at that option. Thank you.
And Elke, I see there's some questions there for you. You're happy you answered. Did you want to comment on what's come through there?
I guess I can comment on the tarps. We certainly are starting to see more and more real-time sensors being plugged into our networks, into our rivers, and providing a richness of data. And a lot of that's open data that's available and able to be used to better understand and develop models to forecast impacts of events. So yeah, it's certainly an area that we're seeing with as the cost of technology decreases and our access to this type of sensor technology advances. I think we're moving quite quickly into a space where we can forecast and get visibility of where we're going to see impacts from different events, and then of course well advanced in the seismic space. But yeah, certainly in the storm event space, we're improving. One piece that I really didn't cover beyond the water in that Cyclone Gabrielle was the slash. So the organic matter that was coming down the rivers was actually the destructive element, not so much the water. And that is a little bit more challenging to be able to identify coming down the path without a good understanding of the land use. So there are significant changes to policy around land use that are in effect in New Zealand, particularly around forestry as a result of that disaster.
Just a comment on that, Elke. I'm so glad that you've mentioned it. There's many of the smaller island nations that suffer exactly the same problem. In the Solomon Islands, for example, same problem. The timber washes down with a flood. It blocks the bridge becomes a dam. It was never designed to be a dam, and it falls over. So quite intensive policy and mechanism to actually address a problem stream up in your forestry areas. where there's harvesting taking place, it needs to be a clean operation. And that's one of the secrets, because otherwise you just leave all that debris to be washed down the river. Thank you.
Yeah. And if I can, I think that just re-emphasizes that we can't build or maintain a resilient road in isolation of what's going on around us. So, you know, it's the slash, it's, you know, as I said earlier, you know, many of the developing countries don't have municipal garbage schemes. So the household waste has to go somewhere. Typically it gets thrown in the drain just at the edge of the town limits. So, you know, there's a whole lot of things that we need to look at if we're actually going to create this resilient transport system. Are there any more questions there? Anyone can jump on in to the Q&A. What I would do is invite you to keep on track. There's a number of these sessions dealing with a whole lot of the green roads over the next several months. So the Green Road Initiative itself is more than just building a green road. It's, I think, got 9 different areas in it. There is the decarbonisation aspects and building a low carbon road, but there's elements around the resilience. There's elements around keeping biodiversity. Just trying to think, Tiens is going to try and remind me of the others soon. But you know, so it's a really interesting series you'll see coming up. And again, for those who can make it to the Transport Forum in May, there's some workshops on all of this. So again, really good opportunity. If you haven't been exposed to the Green Roads program to date, then I'd encourage you to get along to those workshops if you can possibly be there, or get hold of some of the recordings that are likely, I'm pretty sure, come out of those to do that. Otherwise, I'd just like to thank Elke and Tiens. If there's no further questions, thanks, Gordon, for the response. Hang on, we've got the one here from Carter. Do you think there is a certain level of balance that is required in terms of climate resilience strategies and sustainability? Would we ideally want contractors to investigate more sustainable for road construction? Should contracts also cover an element of sustainable, innovative thinking as tendering requirement? We've certainly seen that. Did you want to pick that up, Tiens? We've certainly seen it on some of the recent PPP programs here. There is a need to look at this, that, you know, in most countries, especially if there's a reasonable amount of traffic, you know, 90+% of the emissions are from the vehicles. You know, so you may be talking about 10%, in some countries even less, might be down to maybe 5% or even less is coming from the actual physical works. So we can be much smarter, yes, but the question is, at the end of the day, does it achieve much versus actually looking at how do we do work? So, for instance, you could save a little bit doing different construction techniques. You could make a much greater impact by not doing roadworks at certain times of the day, or optimizing our work zones to make sure the traffic flows as best we can. So what we do is almost less important than how we do it. The lower the traffic volume, you know, if you get into remote Mongolia, where I've been fortunate to work, it's the reverse. You know, there's not enough traffic to dominate. So suddenly what you do becomes far more important. So we have tools now. ADB, we've developed a toolkit which adds on to HDM and lets us do the full life cycle analysis of where all the emissions are coming from. So you can look at it and say, what's important in my particular country?
Just on that, Ian, on that toolkit from the ADB, and what you will see that often some of these strategies that would give you a more resilient outcome by nature would also be addressing some of your climate mitigation concerns. That toolkit is very good in identifying those areas where you address more than one issue at the same time.
Thanks. Yeah. So the toolkit overall that the Green Roads one, I think it's 150 different initiatives you can try. Yamnan, yes, you can do your community-based maintenance. Often the community-based is actually very well related to the climate resilient because it's typically doing the off-road maintenance. It's keeping the drains clean. It's doing those basic tasks. Then you can come through with the other activities. So yes, the answer is yes, you can, and it does align well. I realise we're out of time. I do want to say thank you again to Alkiantians for joining us. And I wish you all safe travels or wherever you are, whatever your afternoon or the rest of your day holds. For Alkiantians and I, it's a good night from us. Thank you.
Thank you all.